In fact, they're hidden, but they're everywhere. And so my goal tonight is that I make you aware of these differences, these sort of foundational differences. The two main things I'm going to speak about today are this idea of competing doctrines. And it's up on the slide. We'll talk more about it in a second. What I mean by competing doctrine is that there's one, and a doctrine is something that's all inclusive. It speaks about knowledge, it speaks about values, it speaks about who you are as how you identify. And there's two main doctrines that I'm going to talk about today. One is the doctrine that I call normative Islam. What I mean by normative Islam is that Islam, with the majority of Muslims have practiced from the time of the Salaf throughout the ages up until today. And the other doctrine is going to be Western liberalism, and we'll talk heavily about what that means and where it comes from. Keep your questions in your mind. Don't forget about them. I know as we go along, there's going to be some things that come up that need clarification. There's going to be questions. In fact, what should happen as we go along is that you should start making connections. Light bulbs should be going off. Things that I mention should connect with things that you've seen, noticed, or experienced yourself being in America, or having come to America for many of us. So a comprehensive doctrine. A comprehensive doctrine is essentially commonly held beliefs that everyone in a culture holds onto. They include values, morality, sometimes religious, sometimes metaphysical, meaning that they're not necessarily scientific. They tell us about what we believe, how we view ourselves, what goals do we have. The goals can be individual, communal, political. So all of this comes together and it forms what's called a comprehensive doctrine. But first off, when I use the term liberalism, this is very important that you understand. What I am not talking about is political liberalism. When I say liberal, I don't mean conservative versus liberal. I don't mean Republican versus Democrat. I mean philosophical liberalism. These are two very different things. Again, let me say that again. I want it to be very clear for the adults in the room. When I say liberal, I do not mean political liberal. I do not mean the Democrat or the left wing. But rather what I mean is a philosophy that is called liberalism. What is that philosophy? So liberalism is this idea, a philosophy that says that the individual comes first and that the individual's liberty and freedom de facto comes first, meaning it's not something that has to be proved. It's not something I have to justify to you. I don't have to give you a bunch of proofs, some dala'il to say that this is what should, your liberty comes first above and beyond everything. That this is an accepted fact. That if the government is going to tell you to restrain yourself, or any authority for that matter, that it needs to justify why it's restraining you, because the default is you should be able to do whatever you want to do. So liberalism is a philosophy that starts from a premise that political authority and law must be justified. Meaning if you're going to put rules and laws on individuals, you have to prove first why. Why am I mentioning that? Why is that the definition? Because by default, we should be free to do whatever we want. And if there's going to be restriction, it must be proved to us why it has to be there. If citizens are obliged to exercise self-restraint, and especially if they are obliged to defer to someone else's authority, there must be a reason why that reason must be proved. Restrictions on liberty must be justified. So I told you guys, this is a little bit dense and heavy. I'm going to go through quotations from a bunch of liberal philosophers. Now, these aren't just any individuals. These are the individuals that have shaped how they have shaped our doctrine, our comprehensive doctrine here in the country and in this part of the hemisphere. So these aren't just random people, these are actually well-known philosophers in the field of liberalism. So we need to pay attention to this. As I had mentioned, our default position is that we are all free, according to the doctrine of liberalism. We should be able to pursue whatever we want to pursue, without any restriction, without any coercion. This is our way of life, this is our value system, this is our epistemology. Again, why is this important? And I want to keep emphasizing, this is important because this is the water that we swim in. Your kids breathe this every single day. This is what makes up their thinking. This is what makes up their values. When you send them to school, when you turn on the television, when you show them a movie, when they go around looking at advertisements, when they see other people, this is the water that they live in. This is what they're exposed to. This is what their thinking is based upon. If you want to understand the people around you, if you want to understand your own children who grew up here, you need to understand this. If you want to understand yourself, if you had grown up here, you need to understand this. There's no separating this from us. So this author, she wrote, every adult should be able to make as many effective decisions without fear or favor about as many aspects of his or her life as is compatible with the like freedom of every adult. Liberalism, meaning this is the original and only defensible meaning of liberalism. Again, just driving home the point that by default, we should be able to do whatever it is that we'd like to do. Before we get more into this, we have to understand something called ontology. Ontology is the study of reality. We may have never thought about this. Ontology is the idea of what actually exists. So, for example, we may be familiar with the ontology of Islam. The ontology of Islam is that before there was anything, there was Allah. Everything exists by the will and the power and the knowledge of Allah. Reality is here because He brought it here. And therefore, everything exists because of Him. This is our ontology. But the ontology of liberalism is not this. Before I get into the origins, ontology, it also tells us relationships between things. So the idea that you need to understand is that Islam has an ontology, as I just mentioned. Liberalism has an ontology as well. And they are two fundamentally different ontologies. Liberalism takes out Allah out of the equation entirely. The default in the ontological default in liberalism is that we exist. And we are gods in a sense, in that we should be able to do whatever we want to do without restriction, as I had mentioned earlier. So in that case, if we see, so for example, in our society, we argue for the freedom of religion, right? In Western philosophy, Western liberalism, we argue that everyone should be free to have whatever religion they'd like. The basis of that argument, why is that argument true? The basis of it is, as individuals, we have liberties, and we should be able to do whatever we want. Therefore, we should be able to choose whatever religion we'd like. Make sense? In Islam, for the one who isn't a Muslim, we say the same thing. La ikraha fid din. A person has the right to choose whatever religion he'd like. Same conclusion, but how we got there is very different. Liberalism says we got there because by default we should be able to do whatever we'd like. And choosing religion falls in that. Islamically, we got to that decision because Allah said, La ikraha fid din. Same conclusion, but two different ontologies that led us to the same conclusion. Why is that important? Why can't we just say we are at the same decision, therefore it's the same? Why bother? It's important because it lays the groundwork for what is right and what is wrong. Where we get our decisions from, where does it come from? So if we come to the same conclusion, fine and good, but understand that we got there in two different ways. If we understand where we come from, then we'll understand the other conclusions when we get there. So let's talk a little bit more. Let's talk about the origins of the two. Liberalism, its origins are very different. If we look at Western heritage, we can take it perhaps back all the way to the time of the Greeks. The Greeks had a philosophy, right? Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, they built upon it. And then from there it continued. The Romans, then Christianity came, added a lot to it. What I want you to understand is this thread of thinking. So we started, say, at the Greeks, and then we went forward, we hit the Romans, they added, they changed. We went forward, we hit Christianity. Christianity had a tremendous impact on Western thought. And then we went forward and then hit the Renaissance. How many people have heard of the Renaissance? The Renaissance. So what happened in the Renaissance? In the Renaissance, we had this situation where the church controlled thinking. The church controlled who was part of it and who was not, who was a good citizen and who was not. The church controlled science, it controlled geography, it controlled politics. It was hegemonic in the sense that it decided how people lived, how they died, and what they did in between. In the Renaissance, we started to have a break. That there were thinkers in the West who didn't like the intellectual constraints that the church had put on them. So they wanted to break out of it. The likes of Galileo and Copernicus, big names now, but at the time, they were religious people. Newton, religious people. But the church restricted them in their thinking and slowed them down, so they broke out of it. And the way they did it is they enforced it by excommunication. If you didn't do what we told you to do, if you didn't think the way that we wanted you to think, then we'd kick you out of the church. And once you're excommunicated, that's it. You're out of the society. You're out of community. In a different way, Martin Luther did something similar. Who's Martin Luther? Anyone? How many people heard that name? Not Martin Luther King Jr. A bunch of hands went down now. Martin Luther is the founder of Protestantism. What did he do? He broke off from the Catholic Church for a bunch of theological reasons. But the point I want to show is that there was now a split of the church as well. Again, for the reason that the church was trying to hold on to it. What became of this is the scientists who broke off from the church wanted to separate church and state. It made sense for them. Because in order to continue scientific and intellectual advancements, the church was a hindrance. So let's break it off. Let's cut off. Church, you can go over there. We will do the rest. Martin Luther did the same thing. Because of his break from the Catholic Church, he said the church, go over there, and we should be separate. So he himself advocated for separation of church and state. So that's why even in countries like this, which is heavily Protestant, the idea of separation of church and state is still accepted by religious people. There was a second issue, which was the monarchy. Europe was a bunch of feudal states. There were kings and there were queens who controlled you as a person. The church controlled you intellectually, the monarchs controlled you physically. You stayed in these boundaries. You worked these fields. You were indentured servants. You worked for the king, you died for the king. He said, go to battle, you went to battle. He said, go work in this mine, go farm this field, that's what you did. So their heritage was shaped by this. And eventually it was a rejection of this. It was a rejection of the monarchy. It was a rejection of the church. So these experiences now fed into their ideology. The individual is more important. Why? Because we saw what the church did. Science and empiricism is more important. Why? Because the church prevented it. The individual should be able to travel, free to do whatever they want. Why? Because the monarchy had prohibited it. So in their minds, this made sense. This is where they went. They continued. What I want you to understand from this, or what I want you to contrast with this now, is this idea of that is their heritage. It is not our heritage. Islam's heritage is different. Islam's origins are different. What is the Islamic origin? we can trace our origin all the way back to Sayyidina Adam alayhi salam. He was the first Nabi. Then after him, Sayyidina Idris, and so on. Nuh, Ibrahim, Ishaq, Yaqub, Musa, Isa, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. All of this is our heritage. As time went on, we went from one Nabi to another Nabi to another Nabi until we came to the final Nabi, Khatam al-Nabiyyin sallallahu alayhi wasallam. But we didn't stop there. Our heritage continued. Our intellectual development continued. The Khulafa came after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Salaf al-Salihin continued that. We didn't stay stagnant. Thought developed. After the Salaf were the Khalaf. The Khalaf are the scholars. They compiled the deen for us. We had books of ahadith. We had books of tafsir. We had schools of fiqh and aqaid. We had schools of development, and all of this is part of our heritage. We continued. We moved into different lands. We moved into different continents. As we came to new things, we developed new ways of handling that, such that we incorporated it into what it meant to be Islam. And then we came to where we are today. We have our own heritage. We have our own doctrines. We have our own history of conflicts. We have our own cultures that we have brought into Islam. So what you should understand, when you understand the idea of a comprehensive doctrine, the West, liberalism has its doctrine. Islam has its doctrine that is comprehensive. It includes everything that we've experienced and everything that we believe. Now when we start looking at, suppose we look at Islam, we have to be very careful. Are we looking at Islam from the eyes of Islam, or are we looking at it from the eyes of the West? This is what Orientalism is, right? We know what Orientalism is? Orientalism is the study of Islam, or the study of the East, the study of the Orient by who? The Westerners. It's them looking at us through their glasses, through their lens. So obviously, what they see and how they interpret will be shaped by their experiences, their heritage. So they made all kinds of mistakes studying Islam. The mistake that we often make today, and one thing that I want you to really ask yourself, and especially those of us who are Western educated, or those of us who are Western born, how much of our thinking is actually Islamic in heritage, and how much of our thinking is actually Western in heritage? You don't get taught this in school. In school, they don't sit you down and say, this is Western, this is liberalism, and this is Islam. That this is the way this doctrine would look at it, and this is the way another doctrine. Some of us who are older, we may remember when we used to discuss communism versus democracy. And so that too is a piece of a study of a doctrine versus another doctrine. How many of us are old enough to remember the Cold War? It's got to be more than one. Yeah. This is a big thing, right? For those of us who are in the United States, it shaped the way we saw the world. All of our enemies were Russian accented. If you looked at movies at the time, every bad guy was a Russian. That's how you knew he was a bad guy. When he opened his mouth, he had an accent which was from Russia. Because we saw the world in that way. Where are the bad guys today from? Where? The Middle East. As soon as they open their mouth, their accent is different. Right? As soon as you watch a movie and the guy opens his mouth and he's got a Middle Eastern accent, you know who the good guy is and you know who the bad guy is. These are doctrines clashing. So let's keep going. There's another thing that had happened to Europe that defined it. I mentioned two things that defined Europe. The first one was, it was a clash against the church. The second one was a clash against monarchy. The third one is a clash against Islam. How do we understand this? Today, we're used to looking at nations and we see borders, right? Every country has a border. The United States has a border with Canada and Mexico. In Europe, they have borders. They have borders at Turkey and Syria, Iraq and Iran. These borders have conflicts many a time. But you understand one side of the border to belong to one group of people and the other side to belong to another group of people. During the Middle Ages, there were no state borders, but rather borders were defined by another way of identifying yourself. One big way of identifying Europe was with this boundary against Islam, meaning that there were centuries and centuries of fighting that had taken place between Islam and Europe. So Europe, so much so that if you asked what is a European, you're not going to get one definition. But if you really wanted one definition, the definition you could have given was that a European is not a Muslim. So the point of this map is to show you that those days, the way you saw the world was in purple, we're all European. In orange or yellow, those are the Muslims. Those are the other. So this boundary used to change, right? What we see in Andalus, it had come all the way to the part of northern Spain, southern France. Italy at one point was under Muslim rule. The Balkans, Eastern Europe, was under Muslim rule. That these boundaries had come in pretty far into Europe, and then they were eventually pushed back. So 3 ways that Europeans identified themselves, or 3 ways that affected their way of thinking. Number 1, rejection of the state. Number 2, rejection of monarchy. And number 3, Islam, the other. What's the point of all this? This is their heritage, the European experience. The Ottoman Empire was at their doorstep for centuries until they managed to finally break it apart in World War II. Epistemology. Epistemology is a fancy word. All it really means is how you know what you know. How you know what you know. It's a study of knowledge. So epistemology, we spoke about ontologies, how you view the reality. We spoke about heritages, where do you come from? We see the differences between the 2 groups. When we look at epistemology, where do they get their knowledge from? That too differs. Thomas Locke, who's being quoted here. Thomas Locke is a highly influential liberal philosopher. How many of us have heard his name? Yeah, I'm surprised it's that little. I mean, everyone who's gone to school, public school in the United States, should have heard Locke's name. Because you cannot understand the Western mind today, the liberal mind, without knowing who Thomas Locke is and his ideas. And if you don't know him, go read about him. If you're going to live here, you're going to have your children here, they're going to grow up with his ideas, you are going to absorb his ideas, you might as well know who he is. Thomas Locke, and you will have heard this idea as well. Thomas Locke came up with this idea that religion must be logical. It must be rational. So much so that even God is bound by logic and reasoning. Even God is bound by logic and reasoning. Anyone know there was a group among the early Muslims, some of them still exist today, who held this belief? Anyone know who that is? Yes. Raise your hand. Who said that? MashaAllah. Good. Just want to know what kind of knowledge we have in this crowd. So there was a group called the Mu'tazila, and they too held this idea that rationality reigns supreme, so much so that even Allah is bound to follow it. Na'udhu billah min dhalik, we don't believe that. Thomas Locke changed Christianity. How did he change it? Again, why is this important? Because the way that he changed Christianity, if you pay attention, you will see parallels in people who are trying to change Islam in the same way. He changed Christianity by introducing this idea that everything must be logical. God himself must follow logic. So if we as a people decide logically, rationally, this must be good, then even God must consider it good. Therefore, the way to understand Christianity properly is to apply logic and reason to it. So much so that now Christianity has to abide by the dictates of the logic and rationality that has been put forward by liberal philosophy. Christianity can only exist if it corresponds with it. Judaism can only exist if its beliefs are now in line with it. Islam is different, though. Islam says that everything is rooted in Allah. Things might be logical and rational, and oftentimes they are, but they're not good because they fit our logic and reasoning, but they're good because Allah deemed them to be good. So we place Allah at the center of everything. Allah does what He wills. Whether it corresponds with our reasoning or logic, it doesn't matter. That's irrelevant. In fact, good is what Allah does. Good is what Allah commands. That is the definition of it, not logic and reasoning and what you think. But if we were to take that Locke idea and bring it to Islam, what would it do to Islam eventually? What would be the end result if we were to take his logic and use it in our deen? Not necessarily. What's that? Not necessarily. I know where you're going, but not necessarily. It would be the same thing that happened in Christianity. Exactly. That's what I'm getting at. That it would reform the religion. Reform it in what way? Reform it so that it fits in with liberal philosophy. Because that's what they've already done to the other religions. And Islam is still holding out. There's another important, actually one more thing about morality before we move on from there. There are certain things, this is an important point, a little bit of a subtle kind of nuanced point, but listen to me. In our culture, and by that I mean American culture, if something is legal, it's thought to be good. If something is illegal, it's thought to be bad. Is it bad to speed over the speed limit? We would say from our culture, yes, that's bad. Islamically, it doesn't have to be. Meaning, something can be illegal, something can be legal, but still be makruh, disliked. So what is found in legal terms doesn't necessarily have to be moral, which is an important point to keep in mind, because oftentimes in the United States, if something becomes illegal, marijuana was illegal. The majority of the public considered it to be evil, bad. Only bad people smoke weed. Those of us who are older, we remember those times. Then it became legal. Now it's not evil. Now it's not bad. Now if someone wants to smoke, we say that's fine. Has morality changed? No, it has not. It does not. But what's changed is legality. And if we're not careful and we become liberal in our philosophy, then our morality will change along with that legality. Everyone follow that? Whereas Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, He told us, وما كان لمؤمن ولا مؤمنة إذا قضى الله ورسوله أمرا أن يكون لهم الخيرة من أمرهم ومن يعص الله ورسوله فقد ضل ضلالا مبينا. That no Muslim or Muslimah, no believer, man or female, male or female, if Allah and His Messenger decree something, neither one of the two has a choice in that matter. So when it comes to legality, that's a separate issue. But when Allah and His Messenger have given us something, Allah says that the believing man, the believing woman, أن يكون لهم الخيرة, that person, they no longer have any ikhtiyar. There's no choice left anymore. That whoever disobeys Allah and His Messenger, فَقَدْ ضَلَّ ضَلَالًا مُبِينًا, that person is on a clear misguidance. So our epistemology of what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad, is different than the air that we are breathing in this country. Let's briefly talk about secularism. Secularism is important. Secularism is the process by which secular spheres are carved out of an area that were once non-secular. So if there used to be that this sphere belonged to religion and the church, secularism says, no, we're going to take that from it. This is ours. The church can go elsewhere. A good example of this, one that we have all seen, is the example of LGBT. Before, the idea of LGBT was something that was within the sphere of religion. It decided if it was good or bad, meaning it informed us if it was good or bad. What secularism did, it came in and said, nope, we're taking that from religion, we're making it secular, and now we will decide if it's good or bad. It brought it into the secular sphere. So in doing that, it can take religion out of the equation. Liberalism needs secularism. It is a part of it. In fact, the only way liberalism has the power that it does is by having secularized what is good and what is bad and taking that back from religion. The one can't be without the other. This is really what I wanted to get at. And this is sort of where I want to put in your minds. This is the conflict that I want you to appreciate. The conflict is, one, it should be very obvious to you so far that I've said that there's a comprehensive doctrine which is called Western liberalism, and then there's a comprehensive doctrine that is called normative Islam. Both of them have their values, both of them have their ontologies, their epistemologies, their heritages, their backgrounds, their beliefs, their values. Each one is a system contained within itself. Do you guys all follow? It's not getting too heavy, right? All right, good. Alhamdulillah. So Voltaire, another famous thinker, he said that all men are born with a nose and 5 fingers, and none is born with a knowledge of God. What's the point he's trying to make here? The point that he's trying to make here is that we're all men, and this is something that's natural to us. And religion, he's trying to make the argument, is unnatural, is something separate. Whereas Islam tells us almost the exact opposite. Right? كُلُّ مَوْلُودٍ يُولَدُ عَلَى الْفِطْرَةِ. The Prophet ﷺ informed us that every person who is born on a fitrah. What is that fitrah? That fitrah is the ma'rifah of Allah. It's the knowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists. Allah, before we were even born, He gathered us all together and He said, أَلَسْتُ بِرَبِّكُمْ? That am I not your Rabb? And we all said, Bala, of course. So whereas He's saying that this knowledge is something extrinsic and outside of us, rather liberty and freedom is something that's intrinsic according to Him, we are saying, no, Allah had already indicated to us. In fact, there is nothing that we are born with more stronger in knowledge than the fact that Allah is our Rabb and our Creator. What the Orient, what the West does, it paints the other. The other, let's be frank, is us. It paints us as being backwards, unchanging, rigid. And it presents itself as being dynamic, progressive, flexible, tolerant. But the fact is the opposite. Whereas Islam says that we have a fitrah, that we look at where we came from when we move forward with it. We embrace all of that. What liberalism states is that no, we reject all of that. And instead, we embrace a different value system, which is that we should be able to do everything that we'd like to do. So we run into another problem, and that problem is that liberalism is not really natural to us, even though they claim that we're born with it. And because it's not natural, then it has to impose itself upon everybody else, sometimes by force. There's another thinker, a liberal thinker named Mill, and he had said that liberalism is for the enlightened people. Liberalism is for the enlightened people. And if people aren't enlightened, then we can force them into it until they become enlightened. So there's this idea, a very strong idea, that we can force people into it. Let's read the slide. Islam constitutes a systematic and coherent ideology, just like liberalism and communism. So just like liberalism is a comprehensive doctrine, communism is a comprehensive doctrine, Islam is a comprehensive doctrine with its own code of morality and doctrine of political and social justice. The appeal of Islam is potentially universal, reaching out to all men as men and not just to members of a particular ethnic or national group. So scholars in the West started to realize that Islam actually has this capability of being universal. Why is that a problem for them? Why is that a problem for them? Against? What? It's a threat, right? Yeah. It's a threat. And if we put ourselves in their shoes, it's a threat. They should be worried that they have a comprehensive doctrine by which they mold nations and people. And here's another one that has a capacity to do it on an even greater level. You have to deal with that. So Joseph Raz, he said people are justified in taking action to assimilate the minority group. He was a liberal. People are justified in taking action to assimilate the minority group at the cost of letting its culture die or at least be considerably changed by absorption. So what that means is that if you're a liberal, you need to convert people to liberalism, even if by force. If they're not enlightened enough to know that, you have to do it until they become enlightened enough. If you need to do it in such a way that it causes their way of living to die, so be it. If you need to absorb them into the larger group so they become like one of you, so be it. Halaq, he's an Arab Christian who has written a lot on Islam and nationalism in the West and Orientalism. So he points out in a book called The Impossible State, an excellent text. In fact, if there's any work you're going to read in English, I would say this is near the top of my list. So he said in that liberalism is universalizing. It doesn't tolerate difference in thinking unless it expects you to change later down the road. So if you pay attention and you look at the culture that we live in, and you look at how this culture interacts with other cultures, you will notice that it's not interested in preserving other ways of thinking. is interested in absorbing in those other ways of thinking so that eventually they disappear and they join the larger group, which is the liberal way of thinking. So here, Jeremy Fortier, he writes, liberals have become less inclined to challenge any particular religious doctrine and more interested in demonstrating liberalism's compatibility with a broad range of such doctrines. This is the next step forward. The next step forward is that let's not even have a discussion anymore as to the truth of liberalism. We are right. We don't even need to discuss it with you because we have complete power. We have complete control on thought and thinking, on culture. We don't need to have a discussion with Muslims. We don't need to have a discussion anymore. Rather, we're just going to keep expanding until we absorb you into the group. And so if you want to be part of the future, then you have to become compatible with liberalism or die out. There is no third option. So the result ends up being is that although liberalism started with a rejection of the church, meaning it didn't want to be controlled in its ideology, it wanted to be free in its ideology, so it rejected the church, it eventually found itself at a place where it now wants to control ideology. It no longer wants dissension. It has become the church that it rejected in ideas, in culture, and thinking. So it became what it hated. And what's interesting now is that if you look at our culture now, we're in the era of postmodernism. So in the era of postmodernism, we now see that people are they know they're missing something. So they start looking for spirituality elsewhere. Some people find it in yoga, some people find it in stones, some people find it in old religions, devil worshiping, other type of angel worship, odd things that are coming back in vogue now because the idea of spirituality is built into us. Allah made it there, He created it there. So a person realizes it's missing, and so they start looking for it elsewhere. But anyway, let's keep moving with this. There's a couple conflicts that I want to bring to our minds before we sort of wrap up. The first conflict, differences, and by conflict I mean difference between normative Islam and liberal Western liberalism. The first concept is the rejection of authority. Right? What was the authority that liberalism rejected? It was the church, the Catholic Church. Whereas in Islam, we accept authority. In fact, we demand its acceptance, which is the authority of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We acknowledge Him as our Rabb, as our creator, and His authority. The liberal philosophy, it says it's future facing only, meaning don't look at the past, forget the past. We're progressive. We're always thinking ahead. We're always moving ahead. The next generation will be better than the prior generation. The next generation will be more moral, more correct, more right than the past generation. The people of the past, they were evil, slave owners, murderers, all of the bad things that you can think of. These are the people of the past, not us today. We're good. Tomorrow will be even better. Whereas Islam says no. Islam says we're grounded in the past. We're not stuck in the past, but we're rooted in the past. We're rooted with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, with the Anbiya before. We're rooted with the Salaf. We're rooted with the Khalaf. And then with that firm root, we go ahead. We expound. We move forward. But we don't lose what's behind us. Whereas liberalism says, no, you need to let it go. You need to drop it. So there's a genuine separation here. There's a genuine difference here. This is another quote. Reasonable religious doctrines are considered to be those views that are compatible with political liberalism as much as they are conducive to an overlapping consensus. This brings us to sort of the last concept that we'll speak about, which is political liberalism. We started off talking about comprehensive liberalism. Comprehensive liberalism is your belief, your thought, those things that are personal and the communal as well. Political liberalism says we can leave the morality, we can leave the individual thought, and we'll just build a political structure that is based in liberalism instead. So political liberalism is a framework that is neutral between such controversial comprehensive doctrines, largely restricted to constitutional principles, upholding basic civil liberties and democratic process. Those of us that are from Muslim countries, and those of us who aren't, but we look at them today, what should come into your mind, what should be really obvious to you, is that as Muslims, we inherently will reject comprehensive liberalism in Muslim lands. Here it's difficult. We breathe it, we live it, it's around us. But in Muslim lands, we can reject it. So the next best thing is what's called political liberalism. And that is that you create such a framework in your country that it is based upon liberalism, the government, the values that we want society to have, how we want them to live with one another. We base that in liberalism, but we'll leave out the rest of comprehensive liberalism. Does that make sense to everyone? There's a conflict coming. I'm sure some of us already see it. So the issue is that political liberalism still comes from comprehensive liberalism. So it shares foundations, it shares heritage. And those foundations and heritage is in opposition to Islam. Because this political idea of liberalism, the political aspect of it, it didn't come from a vacuum. It comes from that liberal, comprehensive doctrine. So for example, some of us, we live as Muslims, right? We're here in the masjid sitting right now. We come for the salawat. We teach our kids Islam at home. But in work, our 9 to 5, we have to leave all of that. Some of us, and at least I know most of us, have heard people that their job mandates them to support LGBT. Your job says this person's pronoun is such and such, you must respect it. Although you individually do not. You individually do not support LGBT activities. But your job says you need to do something to show support. So the political structure says you need to act one way while you're in the public. At home or in your own mind, you can have a different set of ideas and beliefs. We'll let that go. What's the result of that? So just the issues that I already mentioned about political liberalism. 1, it shares foundation heritage, which is comprehensive liberalism. 2, it leads to the split identity, which I'm talking about right now. That split identity is that you are going to be different. And how long are you going to keep that up? So Raja Bahlul is a British thinker. I think he's a politician as well. He said, they are to act as if religion does not matter to the way one relates to other citizens. But what kind of self is that which self-consistently can switch between two identities, at one moment thinking that religious beliefs and values are the most important things in life, and the next moment acting as if they do not matter? How many of us have felt this while at school or at work? Yeah, be honest. I have. All throughout my schooling, from elementary school all the way through med school, residency, I felt this. At work now, I still feel this. In my mind, I'm walking around as a Muslim. But in the way I'm reacting with people, I have to show something different. We're expected to, in fact, we're demanded to live a split life, a split personality. So he brings up a really good question, that what kind of a person is expected to live this way, to be untrue with themselves? Alawi, after Saddam Hussein was kicked out, was killed, he became the defense minister of Iraq, and he noted this. He said the prize tolerance of these Western societies has an adverse side in the form of an intolerance or disregard for other civilizations, which may not subscribe to the universal nature of Western values. In other words, that although Western civilization claims to be tolerant, the fact is it is not. Why? The reason it claims to be tolerant is because it sees itself and its values as being universal. We saw this during the World Cup, right? This year, right? The West wanted to impose its values on the Muslim world because it truly felt that its values were universal. And what kind of culture wouldn't accept it? And it took the Muslim world to push back and say, no, your values are not held here. Your values are not universal. You are not as special as you think you are. Others had noted it before. And I mean, Ali Alawi is in the US put him in power. He's in a prime position. He got his power because of them. And he's noticing that there's a contradiction here. Before I mention this quote, we also should be fair. We should understand the fact that Islam has political guidance as well. It has things which it considers to be perfections in politics, and they are not necessarily compatible with political liberalism. Islam has definitions for what is good and what is bad, what is moral and what is immoral. Islam answers the difficult questions of life. It tells us how we can improve our life and improve the lives of other people. So if these two doctrines differ in what they consider to be good, what they consider to be the objective of life, I mean, these are fundamental issues that they differ upon, then we don't have congruence. We have contradiction. We have incompatibility. So in the same way that the West does not really tolerate a different value system, well, Islam tolerates to a much greater degree. But Islam too puts boundaries around what it will accept within its culture and what it will not accept within its culture. For example, if there is something in the Islamic culture, Islamic land, that is a threat to the iman of the people, that's our red line. We'll say you can't do that. Because that's what we value. We value our iman. So we have structures in place. The deen puts structures in place to protect the iman of individuals. The issue that we run into in this country is what? We don't have those structures in place. We don't have those lines, those red lines to protect our iman. In fact, the opposite exists. The culture is created to break down those structures so that our iman can be eroded over time. So here, Mr. Parekh, he said, since liberal values are embodied in the basic structure of liberal society and enjoy enormous power and prestige. You get that? Everyone catch that? That since liberal values are part of the structure of society, it has power, it has prestige. Comprehensive doctrines would over time adjust to and be informed by political liberalism. Meaning, once you impose a political structure of liberalism, what's going to happen to any other comprehensive doctrine? What was that? It'll integrate, or it'll have to fall away to make room. Since the latter is grounded in comprehensive liberalism, meaning political liberalism, this would mean the dominance of the latter, political liberalism, or liberalism, over other comprehensive doctrines. It is a political device with a large hidden agenda. So I'm going to finish with a couple thoughts. And this is where I'm going to put it in front of you. And I want you to give me solutions. We have conflict. One conflict is a conflict between comprehensive doctrines, two of them that give differing advice for the same thing. We live in our context in a culture where that doctrine is in power, it enjoys political support, it has prestige. We look up to it. Be honest with ourselves. We look up to it. After World War II, there was an amazing thing that took place in the entire world, really, but especially in the Muslim world. Many of us and our fathers were completely impressed, awed by the strength and power of the victors of World War II. They did horrible things. Anyone know how many people died between the two world wars? A lot? Is that what I said? Go ahead. So between the two, we're talking over 120 million people. Can you imagine that? 120 million? That's like a third of the United States. That's Thanos level killing. That's huge. 120 million people wiped off the planet in a number of years. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the power that was displayed, the overwhelming force, the conquering of the entire world through colonialism. And the response of many Muslims was not of disgust, but of awe. If they could have such power, then they must be doing something right. If they could be so dominant over the rest of the world, including ourselves, we should learn from them. And so you had modernist thinkers in the Muslim world like Abduh, Jamaluddin Afghani, Rashid Rida, who started saying that Islam needs to change. It needs to become more rational, more empirical, more modern. We should introduce free thought. We should put away dissent. We should become more like them so that we could also have a piece of the pie, some power. So today, the conflict, let's get back to the conflict. The conflict is where we're at today, where we're growing up today. The conflict number two is the rest of the Muslim world. As political Islam gets put onto them, as political liberalism gets instituted. Political liberalism gets instituted in Iraq, in Tunisia. I mean, all the other states have more or less just failed, like Libya, Syria. I mean, these other revolutions that took place just miserably failed. But in other places, as we try to institute more of political liberalism, are we shooting ourselves in the foot? Are we just setting up a situation which eventually down the road will just lose our deen? For us, our children, ourselves who grow up in this country, are we doing the same thing to our deen moving forward? Are we going to find ourselves in a situation where we become like the Christians, where we are liberal in thought, but some of our actions remain Muslim? So what's the solution to this? Does everyone understand the problem? I think I went into great depth here to explain the problem to you. So now the question is, what's the solution? Anyone? Or before that, are there any questions, any clarifications to what I had mentioned? Go ahead. Oh, yeah. Bismillah. Would it be easier for me to take that mic and you take this?
Fine, this is fine. We use the top. So, Assalamu alaikum, Maulana. A very nuanced explanation of this. I wish all the university students were here today, and that is where all this resides today, including my children should have been here from the university. My question, what struck me was the split personality that you spoke about, which I believe I go through almost every day at work. Here I am in the masjid after coming from work every day, uh, apparent Muslim by looks. And then I have this LGBT teammate that I work with every morning, every day. So, am I by default or by not even knowing a liberal that is accepting all day one thing and then coming in the evening and saying no, that is wrong? So what am I? Am I a liberal during day and a conservative at night? Or uh, who am I today now? Where do I fit in into this society? How do I define myself? Um, I'm a Muslim, and we preach that it is wrong. And here I'm all day long as if it's okay. I'm not even acknowledging it. So please.
So that's the question I was asking you.
Yes, so now I want to know that in the answer lies the answer to everything that we asked.
Yeah. So I don't want to jump to the answer as far as I think what it is, because what I really want to do is I want to make this a conflict in all of your minds. And what he's saying is there's something else nuanced here to keep in mind. Those of us who are older, or those of us who have come from a Muslim country, we came from an area where we had the Islamic belief is right. Then we're being challenged after the fact by the change in our culture now. You guys understand? We came from one place, we had a solid foundation, now that foundation is being challenged. That's still better than where our kids are at. Our kids are coming from a foundation of Western liberalism. And now we're trying to break that foundation by introducing normative Islam into it. Who's worse off? Who should we really be worried about? Like, I hear your problem. I have the same problem. I'm way more worried about the next generation than I'm worried about us. Because we're convinced of its normative Islam and we're trying to make a defense against Western liberalism. The next generation who grew up here is convinced of Western liberalism, and now we have to put a dent in that through normative Islam. Do you guys understand the problem? The problem is deep. It's not a superficial problem. It's not, brother, this is halal, brother, this is haram. No, this is, I need to change the way that you think. I heard there's a lot of IT people here. We're talking about changing the coding. The coding itself is corrupted. That needs to change. That's a deep problem to deal with. Right? All of our thinking is coded by our experiences, where we grew up. Even the language that you speak conveys morality. It conveys thought of what is right and what is wrong. So the language that you speak natively has an effect on your thinking. How do we change all that? There was somebody else who had their hand up. Go ahead. So, this is something people say all the time. Well, okay, we can go back to a Muslim country. There's two problems with that. Number one is, I'm born and raised here. This is my country. That's a fact. It's hard for me to leave my parents, my kids. Well, I'm not going to leave my kids. My parents, everyone I know, everything that I've raised, to go. That too is sort of not dealing with the problem, it's running from the problem. And number two, What you should have also realized about political liberalism and comprehensive liberalism is that it's universalizing. You can run, it will find you there. Where are you going to go? So the brother brings up the idea of finding a solution, and that solution is the two things that were mentioned: is we work on ourselves, and number two is that we change our environment. It is mandatory, according to the scholars, that we rectify ourselves. We do what's called our islah. Some people call it tazkiyah, some people ihsan, tasawwuf, whatever name you want to give it. The rectification of a person is mandatory, and what rectification means is that we protect our iman, we grow it, we learn our aqidah, and we practice upon what comes from it, which is our Islam. Till we get to the point that, as Jibreel alayhi salam said to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that we worship Allah ka'annaka tarah, as if you see him. How do we go about doing that? It's a struggle, for sure. As the brother is saying, the first step, and hopefully what I accomplished today, or we accomplished today, is that we understand the problem. We recognize the problem. Then this next step is we work on ourselves in the meantime. What can I do to better my iman, to fortify myself from the water that I breathe, the water that I live in? It's toxic. So we spend time in the company of knowledgeable people, in the company of the ulama, and in the company of the sulaha, in the company of those people who are righteous themselves. We spend time with, and we have our families spend time with, people who have proper thinking, who have been immunized from that type of thinking, that doctrine that we know to be against what we want to have. And then we take steps to change our environment. It doesn't mean we have to go live in the jungle. It doesn't mean we have to go isolate ourselves. But it's upon us to find solutions, because the next generation needs it more than we do. Otherwise, what history tells us is that time goes on, the political structure wears down the individual until the individual, him or herself, changes to accept what is being taught to them. Anyone else? Go ahead. So the brother brings up a beautiful, beautiful point, and I'll tell you my own experience. I'm the son of immigrants. I grew up in suburbia, house in the suburbs, basically what you see on television. A garage, two cars. Alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us a lot. But I grew up in the public school system. I went through all of that. And then eventually I found myself in the madrasa system at the age of 29. So by that point, my mind's already set. I'm an adult. I already have my way of thinking, my way of reasoning. Now, when I sat in the company of scholars, I realized there's a lot of stuff, there's a lot of ways of thinking of mine that are completely wrong. So like the example you gave, I had to empty that cup. And even till this day, I started in 2007. So now, 16 years later, I still catch myself thinking in a way that I know is not the right way of thinking, meaning my programming is still corrupt in some places. How do you change it? You change it with what we call suhbah, right? That's where the Sahaba term comes from. The Sahaba had the suhbah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They had his companionship. These are people of Jahiliyyah who, through the company of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, became the best generation that will ever live. We can attempt to emulate that, and that we find those people that we consider, that we know to be the best of us. We spend time with them, knowledgeable people, scholarly people. MashaAllah, you have an imam here who's very knowledgeable, who himself, he's young, but he's growing, and he has that root of having spent how many years? How many years, Dargo? 11 years around that type of environment. And the madrasa system, for better or worse, people criticize it, saying that it's sort of walled off. But the benefit of being walled off is that you have an environment that keeps out the toxic things, allows you to grow in an environment that is normative Islam. And then you can prosper afterwards or take it with you. Now, not all of us can go and spend 11 years, 7 years, 6 years, whatever. But what we can do is we can find those people who have done it. We can find people who have their head on straight and go sit with them. And trust me, it'll be a lifelong process. I'm pretty sure I'm older than you are. And even till this day, I still catch myself thinking and saying, you know what, this is wrong. And I need to go and rethink that, empty that part of the cup out and start filling it with what's proper. Anyone else? You should have just stopped me. I thought you were behind me.
Yes. Hello. Hello. Yeah. So one of the things, this is more so of a comment, but in the Quran it says that Allah does not change the state of the people until they change the state within themselves. So it's more so the way I see it is like with all the corruption that's going on in the Ummah and stuff like that, especially with all the borders that have been drawn both politically and also all the social changes. It all begins with the individual, and then it moves on to the family, then moves on to the community, and then the nation, then the entire ummah. And that's what people talk about a lot is like you need to have the family unit be strong in order for the entire society to be strong. So that was just my 2 cents.
I'll just add to that, in that the individual is not the end all. And we see that in the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? There was a creation of the Medinan state. And then afterwards, even till this day, the majority of scholarship, majority by that I mean 100% consensus, the ijma' of scholarship is that we should have Muslim leadership. So there is definitely a bottom-up approach, but there is still a top-down approach. And the reason being is that Islam understands that not everyone as an individual will be able to hold on to their iman in the face of threat. And so people need support. They need community. They need an environment around them that protects them when they slip or protects them from slipping. We have times that we're weak. We may want to do something haram. We may lean in that direction, but if the society is made such that we cannot, it will protect us when we're weak. And so both of those need to carry together for sure, individuals, but we need to work on community as well. We can't just throw each other to the wolves and hope that we survive.
I just wanted to kind of add something that I've noticed sometimes helps and is kind of a solution to the problem. We use their ideas of liberalism and freedom and all that to our own benefit, in the sense, like, suppose if we want to pray or do something that's Islamic within the working place, if we have just a little bit of courage to stand up and say, hey, this is my religion. And the good thing about here in America is there is freedom to some extent. Nobody can stop you from, practicing or, like if you want to pray you can just get up and say, hey, I want to pray. And it just takes a little courage. So basically what I'm trying to say is because uh, there is this thing about liberalism, you can use it to your own good and kind of say, hey, this is a free country and I want to practice whatever belief I have.
And that's a good point. Again, I'm here. Half my reason for being here is to challenge you. And so our deen is not just praying. If a person prays 5 times a day, but they think like a non-Muslim, we still have a problem. So you're absolutely right. Use all the tools you have to practice the deen as well as we can. But the problem here is deeper than just outward practice. The problem here is thinking. It's a doctrine that you carry and that you accept. If you can't change that, you might pray 5 times a day right now, but your children or their grandchildren, they likely will not. Not because they are prevented from doing it, but because they now carry the mentality that doesn't even assign it importance. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, brother. Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Thank you. We got a nice idea about the liberalization or liberalism, secularism, and Islam. My question is related with the LGBT. I'm asking you this question from my practical experience. You know, recently the U.S. Supreme Court legalized LGBT right. So in Islam, this is totally not allowed. So in this case, if we see the LGBT lifestyle, you know, their lifestyle is totally funny. It's not nice. It's totally different of a normal society or normal people. So if we see this type of people, so how we gonna reach the message of Islam to them? What do you lead? This is not a right way. This is my question. And my experience, I saw this kind of person few days ago. I asked them, can I talk to you, brother? I said, yes. I asked them about their lifestyle. They just give me 2 answers. It's my freedom. Yes, Supreme Court, give me this legality. So you don't have right to ask me this question. In this situation, this our generation, many kids over here, how we gonna save our children from this behavior and how we gonna reach our message to them? That's my question, this one. Because we are facing this, experiencing this day by day. Thank you.
Jazakallah khair. So from what we discussed today, it should be very obvious to us that what they're doing is logical. What do I mean by that? Their comprehensive doctrine, their philosophy says that liberty is an unquestionable value. Therefore, I should be able to do whatever I'd like to do. That stems from that. So when the belief is everyone is free to do what they want, and then they act on it, they're not doing anything illogical. They're doing something very logical. It makes sense to them. What I'm trying to worry us with is that your children will also have the same belief that I should be able to do whatever it is that I'd like to do. And then whatever comes from that comes from that. So if you go to someone and say, no, in this particular thing, you should not be able to do this, now you're being illogical. You're being illogical. And so if we, on one hand, accept in our thinking that men are born free without any restriction from religion or a creator or anyone else, and we accept that, then we really can't criticize them for acting on that. So if we want to change minds, we have to change it from the root and say that no, we are not animals. We are not born free to do whatever it is that we'd like to do, but rather Allah has created us to be better than that. Allah has created us with values, with a system that allows us to reach our greatest potential and eventually His pleasure and His Jannah. So the discussion is deeper than that. And so when our children one day stand up and say, I want to do that, may Allah protect them from it, it will be our fault for having raise them with that thinking that you're free to do whatever you want, without challenging that and say that, no, you're really not.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
What does liberalism mean again?
Liberalism, and again, let me just repeat this for the people who came after the first slide, that when we say liberalism, we do not mean political liberalism. We're not talking about Democrats or the left. We are talking about a philosophical liberalism, which is a byproduct of the heritage of Europe and the West, which basically is this idea that people have the liberty and freedom to do whatever they'd like, whenever they'd like. And if you're going to restrict that, there needs to be proof for why restriction is correct.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
What is your proposed solution to this?
I'll be honest. In my mind, there's no clear solution. When you put two comprehensive doctrines up against one another, we have the option of trying to make the both are incompatible. Let me throw that out. The two doctrines are not compatible. We have decades to a couple centuries of Muslims in the West trying to make it compatible. We have colonizers that have come to the Muslim world trying to make them compatible. No one has succeeded. In every single place, one of the two has become dominant. And usually it's been political liberalism that has dominated as a doctrine. So the idea of both of them coming together to form one doctrine, my personal feeling, unless someone can convince me otherwise, is that it's impossible. Now we have one of two options. One is that we just learn to live together as different people. I brought up the Cold War earlier. The US, the Americans, and the Russians learned to just live. It was tenuous. It was stressful. But they learned to say, you have your thinking, we have our thinking, we will live as we are. That's one solution, if you want to call it a solution. The other is that we just separate entirely. And I don't think that's a solution. So the only way that I see moving forward is that we have to find a way to understand ourselves and pass it to our children that we have a different doctrine. We don't have to hate on the other doctrine, but we can say we have a different one. It's better for X, Y, and Z reason. You need to hold on to it, but we also need to learn to live with people of different doctrines. How do we preserve our doctrine among ourselves and among our children? We essentially, my thinking, don't conflate this with the deen, this is my own research and thinking, is that we have to learn to live as a subculture within the greater culture. And that would mean that we raise our children in the masjid, that we take them to Islamic schools where their deen is prioritized, and then they can learn everything else in a safe Islamic space where the deen is protected, their iman is protected, and they also learn about the other while they're there. And they have that environment all the way into adulthood, into your 20s, into your 30s, until the mind is firmly set and adulted, that you are protected. And we have to create those institutions. In fact, like mashallah, as I walked around today, I see the beginnings of all of that happening here. It's on us to take action, to help out, to volunteer, to donate, whatever it takes, so that we can create that environment that allows us to practice this doctrine.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum
Jazakallah
salam.
khair. I just want to bring 2 points to my fellow brothers. One thing is, as a Muslim in this community, I don't think it's we have to preach to our to other people who are not Muslim to try to convince them that, okay, you are an LGBTQ and this is against fitra. Okay. Again, let me explain. You are a Muslim. Most of the LGBTQ, they're not Muslim. Okay. So what we have to do is we have to protect our children. We have to teach them that this is against fitra, that this is not us, but we have respect to others. Okay. We don't go out and preach, or we will be in a lot of conflict. The other point I want to bring up is at the time of at-tabi'in, one of the tabi'in, the people who followed Rasul sallallahu alayhi wasallam, but they never met him. And they saw one of the Sahaba and they told him, we are so jealous that you guys saw Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam and we did not meet him. And he gets so angry. And he said, well, you guys were protected by Allah that you did not see what we saw. How would you know that if you were at the time of Allah of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that you were not on the other side, that you were not his enemy? That's all.
Okay, inshallah. It seems like everyone is here for Isha. Jazakumullahu khair for your time. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us hidayah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to see the evil where it lasts. Okay, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, I won't take more than a minute. Assalamu alaikum,
Wa alaikum
everyone.
salam.
I just want to talk about, away from the doctrine, on how we as a Muslim ummah feel about ourselves. And that goes a long way in how we go out and interact with the other communities. In some ways, I feel that when we say the dominant doctrine or the Western civilization is dominant, to our children, especially at home and otherwise, we're feeding onto them that you are growing up to be subservient to a dominant society. Like Muslims weren't weak when we were 30. Muslims were not weak when we were 300. How are we weak when we are a billion? We are not weak, and we should not tell our children that anything about the Muslim ummah and Muslim culture needs to be subservient or be a part of another society. Rather, teach them that they should go out and become leaders, I think, and that's just my thought I'm saying, to become leaders of this society which we participate in, benefit from, and contribute to in many ways that we don't imagine. So bringing up leader to your other point about top-down approach is how I think is a long-lasting solution of these two doctrines coming in together, that our children become the leaders of not just the Muslim ummah, but the overall society. And they, inshallah, with Allah's help, they can change this society because Allah's help can do anything. And that's what we should teach them, that they are to become the leaders of this society and change it.
So now the threat with that, and I appreciate your point. This is a point that is brought up a lot, and it's something worth considering. The problem is that when we tell our children, or even ourselves, to go into the power structures that exist right now, which are based in political liberalism, those are the rules of the game. And in order to rise up those ranks, you have to play by the rules of that game. There's no other way, right? Name me one Muslim leader who is a conservative Sunni Muslim in American politics. You can't. They don't exist. And the reason isn't for lack of trying. There are many people that run for school boards, and I'm not discouraging people. It's an approach, but it's an approach in which we need to realize the harms involved. That if to make it to the top of the political structure such that our voice matters means to lose what it is to have our comprehensive doctrine and instead adopt theirs, then you've lost before you've even had a chance to make a difference. This is the counterpoint to what you're offering. So it's easy and it sounds very good to say that Muslims need to work hard and we need to run for office and we need to get to the top of the political system. Then we will turn around and change society for the good. But in order to do that, if you had to leave what it meant to be a normative Muslim, what do you have to offer by the time you actually get there? So that's where we have to find a solution. All right, Jazakumullahu khair. Again, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us tawfiq, to give us hidayah. These are very difficult questions with almost with even harder answers. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us and our children. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.